Hello, my name is Jacob Carrasco, and I will be doing my video presentation on the Battle of Agincourt. This battle is very significant to the English and something that is celebrated to this day. Now time for some background. Henry's fifth invasion of France. Henry V of England had decided it was time to invade France after failing to reach an agreement in their negotiations over territory. The two countries had been at war for centuries, which is now considered the 100 Years' War. There really had been no true conflict for quite some time until Henry came to throne. There had been tensions about Henry V being king during this time and even attempts of an assassination. France was having its own political conflicts and recently had a civil war. With both these happening simultaneously, Henry thought this was a good time to strike and invade northern France. The English land in Normandy. In August of 1415, Henry V landed in Normandy with his troops. He had only about 12,000 men and set his sights on capturing new cities. There are various different reports on what Henry had brought with him to France, but the overall consensus is that it was a small group of people. They really were not able to do a ton and would be pretty outnumbered if they were to get in any larger altercations with the French. Once arriving in France, Henry began to capture the city of Harfleur. They eventually did capture the city, but it came with many consequences. Depleted troops on way to Agincourt. The capture of Harfleur did great damage to the English army. Their troops were weakened vastly and left with very little resources. This is due to several reasons, such as casualties and disease while on their journey. During this capturing of the city, the French began to gather their own army in order to fight the English. They were never able to fight against them at Harfleur, but were ready for another attack shortly after. On October 8th, Henry tried to lead his army to the port of Calais and return back to England. He was then blocked by French forces from going further and tried to find a way around it. This is when the French had intercepted them near the village of Agincourt. Both sides ready for battle on October 24th. There was a field near Agincourt where the two armies met. The French army was significantly larger and more prepared than the English. The French had somewhere around 20,000 to 30,000 men, while the English had significantly less, with only about 6,000 to 9,000 men. Most people had thought that there would be no shot of the English army finding a way out of this. They had few resources left and were very tired after previous battles and a lot of walking in France. Setting and strategy. Empty and narrow field near Agincourt. The precise location is unknown, but most historians have come up with an ideal spot where it all went down. It all took place in an open field that was surrounded by woods. This land was near the villages of Tramecourt and Agincourt. The empty land wasn't very wide and definitely had an impact on the strategy for both armies. They had to split their men up into groups and each had a special job. This is probably a common occurrence for almost all military battles, but it would give an advantage to a particular army. The English strategy of dividing their army. The English had significantly less men, and this led to the strategy becoming a very important part in trying to become victorious in this battle. There were different types of soldiers in this army and split them up into three different groups. There were groups of men who would fight in the hand-to-hand combat and those who had longbows and were able to attack from long range. They were split into three different groups and each had led by a different official close to Henry V. Those with longbows were placed near the sides when lining up, and those who were able to complete a melee in the center. This is usually how all armies would shake out, but they also mix and match a bit where some of the men would go. Henry gave them a long speech prior to the battle and reminded them of all the previous battles they had been on. This fired up the army and they were ready to fight. Now time for the French strategy of dividing their army. The French had so many men in battle and were ready to take back Harfleur that the English had just captured. The men they had were responsible for various types of roles that the English did not have. The army was split up into two different groups, one in the front of the battle and the other in the back. The guys in the front were supposed to make way for those in the back and give them better opportunities to attack. They did not have as many men attacking from the long range as they thought. It would not be useful with how many men they had in melee combat. There was also a smaller third group. It was even further back, but not very critical in the overall strategy of the battle. They had more men than they knew what to do with. They eventually got ready and were off to battle. Terrain favored the English army. The terrain it took place on gave a significant advantage to the English army. Since the land was more narrow, the French army could not go very wide and overwhelm the English. They were pretty much on an even playing field, even though the French had significantly more men. The woods that surrounded the piece of land also prevented any flank attacks from happening. This would have been detrimental for the English due to their lack of men, but still gained another advantage. There had also been significant rainfall before the battle, leaving the field very muddy and wet. This slowed down the French army and gave the English time to attack from long range. Fighting and battle. English archers dominated the battle. On the morning of October 25th, the battle had finally commenced. This is where the archers had finally showed their dominance and made a significant impact on the battle. With how muddy the field was, it slowed down the French forces and gave the archers a perfect opportunity to attack. No one had been able to reach them in time and were able to defeat several of their soldiers who were on the front line. With how narrow the field was, it had become hard to flank the archers and stop them from doing any more damage. Another aspect that made them so successful were stakes they put in the ground for protection. This is a strategy they had never used before, but found successful in this one. They were very difficult to pull out and slowed down the French army even more. This is also when the archers would drop their longbow and fight by hand. Narrow field pushed the French army tightly together. There were so many French men on the battlefield, but not enough space for them to all go. The army was mostly made up of men who fought in hand-to-hand combat and needed an adequate amount of room to be successful. This led the English to overwhelm them and have a significant impact on the final result. Their strategy had also been affected by this narrowness of the land. The archers were supposed to be on the sides of the soldiers who fought by hand, but were pushed behind them. This lessened their effect and almost completely removed them from the battle. The French began to panic and were surprised with what the English were doing. Half of the French men were completely left out of battle, and the momentum shifted completely towards the English. Full suits of armor allowed better melee from French. One of the only successful parts of the French did have during the war were their full suits of armor. This prevented various different attacks and allowed their soldiers to remain standing. This is better than having people front with shields and protecting those who attacked by hand. This ultimately did not matter for them, but was something they might have been able to use in the future battles and innovate it to be even better. However, although this all seemed like a good idea, it was also one of the reasons for the French army's downfall. It made the army a lot slower and not able to beat anyone by speed. With how muddy the battlefield was, it stopped some soldiers from moving any further and eventually killed. There were also been reports that some of these soldiers even drowned in the mud as their helmet had been filled with it. France suffered a disastrous defeat. All these outcomes and parts of the fight eventually led to an English victory. There were hardly any successful attacks on the English army, even with all the men the French had. Everything had just gone their way and not something that could have been predicted before. Towards the end of the battle, Henry started to take prisoners and eventually use them to his advantage. He was scared of another attack starting and wanted to prevent any chance of that happening. About 6,000 men of the French had been killed, and many of them were noblemen. This is about as many people as the English army had total. Significance. This battle gave a significant morale boost for the English. The English had suffered several different defeats before and had finally become victorious at the Battle of Agincourt. The outcome of this one had also looked very bleak before returning several weeks later with new resources from the French and still a good amount of the army still intact. It was greatly celebrated throughout England and even used in different types of music and literature. Folk music had been inspired by this battle and still even used today. The music was used for the arrival of King Henry in November of 1415 and is now used in celebratory events for the English. Shakespeare even wrote a play about King Henry and this expedition. There are also museums in Agincourt that are dedicated to this battle. It contains artifacts from battle and even has a list of people who died while in combat from both sides. The image of King Henry V had improved. Prior to the battle, the view of King Henry V was very controversial and many people wanted him off the throne. He went to capture parts of France in order to boost his image and was successful in doing so. Henry is now seen as a hero in England, and many things have been made in remembrance for him and his military campaigns. As previously mentioned, Shakespeare even wrote a play on him called Henry V. This play shows how a king should be and uses the example of Henry and his time on the throne. The king needs to have several virtues to be successful, and Henry did just that. Opportunity to leech more money from French. The French were so weak following the Battle of Agincourt and gave the opportunity for the English to take advantage even further. There was a lot of stuff the English could now steal from the French army that had been left on the battlefield and used for themselves. There were also several prisoners taken by the English they would then use to gain even more money. They would hold them for a ransom until the French finally decided to pay it out. If the French never followed through, Henry V then would kill them, and they were no longer any use to him. This was seen as very brutal, but praised by many, and what made him a good king. This battle led to future military campaigns on France. This is the boost the English needed in order to gain support for even more military campaigns. They were also weakened throughout their time in France and needed to regroup and further strategize to find a way to be successful once again. It took a while for them to finally return and gather enough resources and men to return to battle. France was fractured even further from this battle and very vulnerable for another attack. This is what Henry decided to do several months later and led a campaign to Normandy. It was pretty easy as much of the damage had been already done on the prior visit to France. Overall, there's further opportunities for the English to be successful and find ways to become even more powerful. These are the works I used in order to build this presentation: Wikipedia, Britannica, and National Archives. Thank you for watching.